Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. And I mean that. I know I say it in every single video, but welcome back. It's great to have you here again. And in today's video, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy. And the reason why I'm speaking about Russia is because everybody is interested in what's happening. And I'd just like to have a quick point of order about these videos, because what I'm trying to do is share real-time data with you to show you exactly what's happening in Russia. What I'm not trying to do is predict the future. But when I post a video like this, I can guarantee that I'll be hit with hundreds of comments from people saying, "Oh, Joe Blogs, you've been predicting what's going to happen in Russia for the past 3 years. You're talking rubbish." I'm not trying to predict anything. I'm just trying to give you some data, because data from Russia is hard to come by. The Kremlin has actually stopped releasing lots of information. At the start of the war in the Ukraine, we could get lots of detailed data, so we could go through all the different pros and cons as to what was happening, whereas now we're having to feed off crumbs. But today's video, I want to talk to you about what's happening to revenue from oil and gas and liquefied natural gas, because Russia is having an absolute nightmare so far in 2025. Now, this data has been published by the Kremlin, not me. It's not me predicting the future. This is actual data that Russia has released. And they've confirmed that in June, oil and gas revenue was down by 33.7% compared to June 2024. Now, to put that into context, if I was the chief executive of a major company, maybe listed on NASDAQ or something like that, and I came out and said, "Hey, everybody, here's the results. The revenue is down by 33.7%. Any questions?" Yes, well, obviously, the big question would be, what the hell is going on? You are doing a really bad job. So when we're talking about oil and gas revenue for Russia being down 33.7%, that is a serious issue. And the reason why it's so serious for Russia is because oil and gas revenue accounts for around 40% of all of Russia's revenues. So if you've got a fall of more than a third in your primary source of revenue, then that means that you're not going to have as much revenue to be able to spend on things to invest into, such as the war in Ukraine. So this is a major issue from the Kremlin's point of view. And if we look at the figures for the first 6 months of 2025, they are down by 17% to 4.73 trillion rubles. Now, once again, if I was that chief executive of a company and I was announcing a first half performance that was 17% lower than it was this time last year, serious questions would be asked. So Russia is in a very difficult situation. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. One of the things that drives me crazy is spam marketing, whether it be text messages, emails, or my personal pet hate, phone calls. People ringing you up trying to sell you things that you literally don't want. And the reason why you're getting more and more of this is because of data brokers. They can take your personal information and sell it on the internet. So the problem you've got is, how do you stop these data brokers from selling your information? Well, you can actually contact them all individually and ask them to take you off their database. But who's got the time for that? Well, the answer to that is Incogni. Once you sign up with Incogni, they will contact all of the data brokers on your behalf and remove you from their databases. And the great thing is that they'll also protect you from identity theft and cybercrime. And the great news is that you can get a 60% discount off an annual plan, which is what I use, by going to incogni.com/Joe Blogs or clicking in the link in the description below. Now, in terms of answering the question as to why Russia's oil and gas revenue is down so significantly so far this year, well, part of it is down to what's happening with oil prices. This chart shows the movement in the price of URALS oil, which is the main blend that Russia produces, dating back to the start of 2022. And you can see that at that time, URALS oil was trading for around $75 per barrel. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, it actually rose above $100 per barrel, which was happy days for Russia in theory, because it was earning the most that it had earned at any time in its history from the sale of its oil. However, unfortunately, the sanctions then kicked in, and that reduced the amount of sales that Russia was actually managing to complete, and so its revenue dipped. But over the last 3.5 years, you can see that generally the price of Russian oil has come down significantly. And the current level of around $63, $64 per barrel is a lot less than it was before the war in Ukraine started. And if we have a look at what's happened in 2025 specifically, because we're talking about what's happened in the past 6 months, you can see that at the start of the year, Russian oil was trading up at around $80 per barrel compared with the $64 right now. So there's been a drop off. And if we look at what happened in the previous year, I think it's quite interesting because in January 2024, you can see that the price was actually less than $60 per barrel. However, because Russia then managed to find ways and means of selling more oil to countries like China and India, the price actually got up to around $80 by the middle of the year. So when you're comparing like for this year and last year, you have to look at a rising price in the first 6 months of 2024 compared with a falling price in the first 6 months of 2025. And if we have a look at June itself, it's really quite interesting because if we look at June 2024, you can see that the price actually was down closer to $60 per barrel. There was a real dip as the US started to impose more sanctions and threaten secondary sanctions on all of the countries that were dealing with Russia. When you compare that to where we are today, it's quite similar. So you can't explain the 33.7% fall in June on what's been going on with the price of oil. So what that means is that Russia is actually selling less volume. So that would be the only explanation when the price is relatively similar. And the reason why it's selling less volume is because the sanctions are continuing to ramp up, and there is a threat of secondary sanctions against countries like China and India. Donald Trump has said that if President Putin doesn't agree to an end to the war, then there's potentially a 500% tariff that's going to be applied against any country that's found to be buying oil from Russia. And China has specifically pulled back on its Russian oil purchases recently. So I think that really explains what's going on right now. It isn't purely to do with what's happening with the price of Russian oil. It's actually the amount that Russia is selling as well. And the reason why this is a big problem for Russia is because they haven't really pared back their expenditure. If you're thinking about this in terms of your household budget, if your income fell by 33.7% this month and in the year to date was down by 17%, you'd be thinking about changing your spending patterns. You'd be thinking maybe on pulling back, not going out as much, maybe not going out to eat, maybe shopping at different places, going a little bit more down market, trying to get things on deals, that sort of thing. And Russia really needs to do the same if it's going to balance its books, because the only other alternative is to dip into your savings, which Russia has been doing over the past 3 years. It's been using the National Wealth Fund to fund the gap between income and expenditure. But as I've reported in recent videos, the National Wealth Fund is now down to around $35 billion compared with over $150 billion at the start of the war. So there isn't that much left in the kitty for Russia to dip into. And as I reported in a recent video, it was recently announced by President Putin that he's decided to pull back on the amount of military expenditure over the next 3 years, which was a real surprise to everybody. Because if you look at what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that in 2020, a couple of years before the war in Ukraine started, Russia spent around $62 billion on defense or military expenditure. As when I mentioned defense previously, I got a lot of messages saying it shouldn't be defense, it should be attack spending that you're calling it. Well, obviously, nobody calls it attack spending, so I'm not going to do that. But you know what I mean in terms of military expenditure. In 2021, it increased a little to 65.9%, but actually in GDP terms, it fell from 4.1 to 3.6. And that's because at that point, the Russian economy was growing, its GDP was getting larger, and so Russia could afford to increase its military expenditure because it had more money to spare. Now, in 2022, it increased rapidly to $102 billion, which equated to 4.6% of GDP. So that represented an increase in GDP at a time when GDP was still rapidly rising. So again, Russia could afford to do that at that point. In 2023, the expenditure went up to 109 billion, which equated to 5.4% of GDP. And I think that's an interesting percentage because 5% is the level that Donald Trump recently floated to NATO, saying all countries should be investing 5% of GDP into defense. And clearly, Russia went over that 5% target. And just to put that into perspective, most countries in NATO are currently spending around 2% of their GDP. So 5.4% is a big number for a large economy. This is an economy that was growing at that point. However, by 2023, the sanctions had started kicking in. So Russia was struggling a bit in terms of growing its GDP. By 2024, the figure had increased to $149 billion, massive, which was 7.1% of GDP. So Russia was continuing to increase both in monetary terms and also in percentage of GDP. Now, interestingly, in 2025, the figure has been announced at 6.3%. So that's less than what we saw in 2024. And the actual dollar figure is down to 145 billion. So still huge compared to where Russia was back in 2020. But we're seeing a reduction in 2025, and President Putin has now announced that there will be continued reductions in the next 3 years. And the reason why there are continued reductions is because Russia is struggling to be able to afford it because they're seeing these huge falls in oil and gas revenues, which are basically the main form of income that Russia has. But as I mentioned at the beginning of today's video, it's not just oil and gas revenues that are falling now in Russia. We've also seen a fall in liquefied natural gas revenue. So in June, it was announced that Russian revenue was down by 4.4%. And that represents a problem for Russia because LNG is basically the only other way that it can monetize all of the gas sales that it lost to the European Union. If you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia was selling huge amounts of natural gas through pipelines that it had built and constructed all across Europe. And this was fantastic business for Russia. And it was also very nice for all the European countries because it was the cheapest way that you can get gas. It comes straight to the pipeline, straight through a pipe, straight to where you want it, mostly in your gas-fired power stations to produce electricity. And so everyone was a winner. But because of the invasion of Ukraine, all the European countries said, we no longer want to buy that cheap gas. Thank you very much. We'll start buying some LNG. And what that meant was that global demand for LNG went through the ceiling, and therefore Russia was able to sell some of its LNG into the markets. And actually, the European Union is still buying some of that Russian LNG because it's difficult to be able to source large volumes of it in a short space of time. However, the USA has now said that it's targeting the European market. It wants Europe to buy more of its LNG rather than taking any from Russia. And the new LNG station that Russia has built, the new gas pipeline, has been targeted by the sanctions. The Americans have basically said that all of the ships have been hit with sanctions. So that's causing problems for Russia from a logistical point of view because nobody wants to get caught on the other side of the sanctions. So Russia is now seeing a fall in its oil and gas revenues, and it's also seeing these liquefied natural gas revenues starting to fall. And if you have a look at this chart, which shows Russia's revenue since the start of the war in Ukraine, you can see the huge fall that's been seen across the board. Back at the start of following the invasion of the war, Russia was earning over $1.3 billion per day from its myriad of different fossil fuel sales. Now you can see the brown section, which represents pipeline gas, has fallen significantly because those pipelines to Europe have now become redundant. But LNG actually was a growth market for Russia, but it's now seeing that market starting to wane as more and more sanctions are applied and countries decide that actually they'd be better off buying this from another source. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we don't get a lot of data directly from Russia anymore. They've severely restricted the amount of information that they're prepared to share with the West. So when we do get some data, we have to have a look at it. So that was why I made this video. Remember, this is Joe Blogs, not Nostradamus Blogs. I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm sharing with you facts and figures and then talking about what I think the implications of those facts and figures are. So please don't send me any messages saying all of your predictions are wrong, because I haven't made any predictions. I'm just telling you what's going on. And what's going on at the moment is that Russia is seeing a huge fall in its oil and gas revenues. In June, the revenues were down by 33.7%, despite the fact that the price of Russian oil was broadly similar to what it was in June 2024. So Russia can't blame that on the price fall. It's down to a volume fall. And the reason why volumes are going down is because buyers are becoming more cautious about buying Russian oil, because they're running the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions and basically could see the US markets close to them in terms of exports. So that's a major problem for Russia. That isn't something that they can easily get around. And if we look at the situation for the first 6 months of 2025, revenues are down by 17%. And as I said earlier in the video, if that was a normal company, that would be a profits warning. You'd be basically having to explain to all of your investors what was going on, because a 17% fall is a massive problem for anybody. And the reason why it's a big problem for Russia is because it needs oil and gas revenue to fund all of its expenditure, whether that be expenditure within Russia or on the war in Ukraine. And as we talked about earlier in the video, over the past 5 years, Russia has massively increased the amount that it's investing into military expenditure. It's more than doubled compared with the figure back in 2020 before the war started. So Russia needs to find more money to fund all of its expenditure, but what's actually happening is that its revenue is going down. Now, liquefied natural gas was seen as a potential growth market for Russia. It's been trying to convert as much of that gas that's still sitting under the ground, going nowhere, into LNG so that it can benefit from the large increase in demand for LNG, partly caused by the war in Ukraine. However, what we've seen in June is almost a 5% fall in LNG sales. And once again, that isn't because LNG prices have crashed or there's no demand for LNG. It's because Russia is now being hit with more sanctions, which is making it more difficult to be able to sell that LNG. So the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen in the first 6 months of 2025 is that Russia has seen a huge fall in its oil and gas and liquefied natural gas revenues. That's going to be a major problem, because that contributes around 40% of all of Russia's revenue at a time when Russia is still spending heavily on the war in Ukraine. And the problem that Russia now has is trying to balance the books. And because the National Wealth Fund has been severely depleted, Russia won't be able to continue dipping into that pot of cash. And so realistically, it's going to have to cut back its expenditure, which President Putin confirmed recently that military expenditure will be cut over the next 3 years. And all of this is leading to major problems in the Russian economy right now. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thanks so much to everyone that's supporting me, either through Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube Super Thanks or Patreon, YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership. I really appreciate your support, and here's something to put a smile on your face.